Sometimes a man reaches his 60s with nothing but dust in his pockets and regrets weighing heavy on his soul. Buck Harmon was that kind of man. For 40 years, he'd drifted from ranch to ranch, running from a past he couldn't outrun. One dusty evening in a frontier saloon, a hand of poker changed everything. He won a locked storage barn, property of a vanished millionaire art dealer. When Buck opened those doors, he found forgotten treasures worth a fortune. Heirlooms, portraits, and artifacts, whispering of love, war, and betrayal. But what would happen when dangerous people came calling? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from tonight. And if this story touches you or speaks to your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly extra special for you. Another powerful tale that will stay with you long after it ends. Buck Harmon's hands told the story of a hard life. At 68 years old, they were weathered like old leather, scarred from barbed wire and branded by years under the Wyoming sun. The knuckles were swollen with arthritis, but they still knew how to work. Every morning before dawn, those hands gripped the rough wooden handle of a pitchfork, spreading hay for cattle that weren't his, on land that would never belong to him. The Dusty Ridge Ranch sat 15 miles outside Cutter's Bend, a town that time had nearly forgotten. The ranch house was modest, painted white once upon a time, but now faded to the color of old bones. Buck lived in the bunkhouse out back, a single room with a cot, a wood stove, and a mirror he rarely looked into. When he did, he saw his father's eyes staring back, tired, distant, full of things left unsaid. His only real companion was Rufus, a mule with a temperament as stubborn as Buck's pride. Rufus was 23 years old, which made him ancient in mule years, but he refused to act his age. Every morning, the mule would bray at Buck through the bunkhouse window, demanding breakfast with the impatience of youth. Buck would curse him gently, pull on his boots, and trudge out into the cold mountain air. "You're gonna outlive us all, you ornery beast," Buck would mutter, scratching behind Rufus's ears. The mule would snort and nuzzle against his shoulder, and for a moment Buck didn't feel quite so alone. Sam Hewitt owned the ranch, had owned it for 47 years. He was in his late 70s now, moved slower than he used to, but his mind was sharp as a tack. Sam had given Buck work when no one else would, asked no questions about where he'd been or what he'd done. That kind of grace was rare, and Buck never forgot it. "You're too good a worker to be drifting at your age," Sam had told him once, years back. "Man needs roots, Buck, a place to call his own." Buck had just nodded, said nothing. How could he explain that roots were exactly what scared him? That staying in one place meant facing all the things he'd spent a lifetime running from? The days at Dusty Ridge followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. Buck rose before the sun, fed the livestock, mended fences, checked the water troughs. His body ached in ways it never had when he was young, but he pushed through. Work was a blessing, really. It kept his mind occupied, kept the memories at bay. But the evenings were different. When the work was done and the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the silence crept in. That's when the ghosts came visiting. Her face, mostly. Caroline's face, as it had been the last time he saw her. She'd been 8 years old, standing on the porch of their little house in Montana, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy, please don't go," she'd said, but he'd gone anyway. Told himself it was for the best, that a man like him, damaged, angry, haunted by what he'd seen in Vietnam, had no business raising a little girl. Her mother had died in childbirth, and Buck had tried. Lord knows he'd tried. But every time he looked at Caroline, he saw Sarah's eyes, heard Sarah's laugh, and the pain was too much to bear. So he'd left, walked away from the only person who'd ever needed him, and spent the next 40 years trying to outrun the shame of it. Friday nights, Buck rode Rufus into town. It was a tradition he'd kept for the 3 years he'd been at Dusty Ridge. The Red Dog Saloon sat on Main Street, a weathered building with swinging doors and sawdust floors. Inside, it smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and old wood. The walls were decorated with cattle brands and faded photographs of cowboys from another era. The regulars were already there when Buck arrived that particular Friday. Hank Morris sat in his usual corner, a grizzled prospector who'd been searching for gold in these mountains for 30 years and never found more than a few flakes. Dutch Keller, a cattle trader with a booming laugh and a generous spirit, stood at the bar. Moses Freeman, a freed slave who'd built a successful freight business after the war, was shuffling a deck of cards at the poker table. "Buck," Moses called out, "you're late. Thought maybe you'd finally gotten smart and decided to keep your money in your pocket?" Buck managed a small smile. "Can't teach an old dog new tricks, Moses. The poker game was a ritual, something that connected them all. Stakes were low. No one had much to lose, but the company was good. They played for the conversation as much as the cards, sharing stories about their weeks, complaining about the weather, speculating about whether the railroad would ever extend out to Cutter's Bend." Buck settled into his chair, accepted a glass of whiskey from Dutch, and let the familiar rhythms of the game wash over him. He wasn't a great player, too cautious by nature, but he held his own. The cards came and went, small pots won and lost, the pile of coins in front of him staying more or less steady. Then, around 9 o'clock, a stranger walked through the saloon doors. He was young, maybe 30, with nervous eyes that darted around the room. His clothes were too fine for Cutter's Bend, city clothes, Buck thought, and his hands shook slightly as he approached the bar. He ordered a whiskey, drank it in one gulp, then ordered another. "You boys playing poker?" the stranger asked, his voice tight. Moses looked up from his cards. "We are. You looking to join?" "I am." The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "But I'm short on cash. Would you take this instead?" He laid the paper on the table. It was a deed, official-looking, with stamps and signatures. Buck leaned forward to read it. The property description said it was a storage barn about 8 miles west of town, on a piece of land that bordered the old Marsh estate. "What's in the barn?" Dutch asked, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know," the stranger admitted. "It's been locked for years. Belonged to Theodore Marsh." Buck felt something stir in his chest at the name. Everyone in Wyoming knew about Theodore Marsh, or at least knew the legend. He'd been an art dealer, came out west in the 1880s with money from back east, built himself a mansion, collected treasures from all over the world. Then about 7 years ago, he'd disappeared, just vanished one day, and no one had seen him since. There'd been searches, investigations, but nothing ever came of it. The mansion stood empty now, slowly falling into disrepair. "Why are you carrying around a deed to Marsh's barn?" Hank asked suspiciously. The stranger wiped sweat from his forehead. "I won it in a card game in Cheyenne, but I need cash, not property. So I'm offering it up. Face value is $200. I'll put it in the pot for that." Moses studied the man for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your funeral. But if that barn turns out to be empty, you're out $200 worth of property for nothing." "I'll take that risk," the stranger said, and sat down at the table. The game changed after that. The stranger played recklessly, betting big, losing steadily. The deed sat in the center of the table like a promise or a curse. Buck wasn't sure which. He found himself staring at it between hands, wondering what secrets a millionaire's barn might hold. 3 hours later, Buck was still in the game. So was the stranger. Everyone else had folded out or gone broke. The pot was the largest Buck had ever seen in the Red Dog Saloon. Nearly $400 in coins and cash, plus that deed sitting there like a golden ticket. Buck's hand was decent, a straight 9 through king. Not spectacular, but solid. The stranger was sweating bullets, his eyes wild. He pushed all his remaining cash into the pot, then added the deed on top. "All in," he said, his voice cracking. Buck looked at his cards again, then at the stranger's face. Years of playing poker with soldiers in Vietnam had taught him to read people, and this man was desperate. Buck didn't know why, didn't much care. He just knew the man was bluffing or close to it, I call, Buck said quietly, pushing his own pile forward. The stranger laid down his cards. 2 pair, aces and 8s. The dead man's hand, some folks called it. But Buck's straight beat it clean. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Moses let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Buck Harmon just won himself a barn." The stranger stood up so fast his chair fell over. He looked like he might be sick. Without a word, he turned and practically ran out of the saloon, the doors swinging wildly behind him. Buck sat there, staring at the deed in his weathered hands. Theodore Marsh's barn. A mystery locked up for 7 years. What did a man like him, a man with nothing, do with something like this? Dutch clapped him on the shoulder. "A hell of a win, Buck. You gonna go see what's inside?" "I suppose I should," Buck said. But his mind was elsewhere, already wondering if this was fate or just dumb luck. That night, Buck lay in his bunk, unable to sleep. Moonlight streamed through the small window, casting shadows on the wall. He could hear Rufus moving around in his stall, restless. Buck pulled the deed from his pocket and read it again by moonlight. Attached to the deed, with a rusty paperclip, was something he hadn't noticed before. A small silver pocket watch. It must have fallen from the stranger's pocket and gotten caught on the papers. Buck opened it carefully. Inside the cover, initials were engraved. T.M. Theodore Marsh. The watch still worked, ticking softly in Buck's palm. It was a fine piece, probably worth more than Buck made in half a year of ranch work. But it was the inscription on the inside that caught his attention. Below the initials, in small script, were the words, "Time is the only wealth we truly possess." Buck closed the watch, held it tight in his fist. Something about those words struck him deep. Here he was, 68 years old, and what did he have to show for all his time? A few scars, a lot of regrets, and a mule that barely tolerated him. But maybe, just maybe, this barn held something more than old furniture and dust. Maybe it held answers to questions Buck didn't even know he was asking. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, Buck made his decision. He'd go to the barn. He'd see what Theodore Marsh had left behind. And whatever he found there, good or bad, he'd face it the way he should have faced things 40 years ago, head-on, with his eyes wide open. Outside, Rufus brayed, calling for his breakfast. Buck smiled despite himself. Some things never changed, but others were about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. The ride to the barn took Buck most of the morning. He'd told Sam he needed a personal day, the first he'd asked for in 3 years. Sam had just nodded, understanding in his eyes, and sent Buck off with a canteen of water and a sandwich wrapped in cloth. Rufus seemed to sense something different about this journey. The mule moved with unusual purpose, his ears pricked forward, alert. They followed the old service road west, past abandoned homesteads and fields gone fallow. The land here had a forgotten quality, as if time itself had moved on and left these acres behind. The barn sat alone on a small rise, surrounded by tall grass that swayed in the wind. It was bigger than Buck expected, built from rough-hewn timber that had weathered to silver grey. The roof was solid, no holes or sag, and the walls stood straight. Someone had built this to last. A heavy chain wrapped around the barn doors, secured with a rusted padlock. Buck dismounted, approached slowly. His heart was beating harder than it should, and he wasn't sure why. It was just a barn, he told himself. Just old furniture and forgotten things. But something in his gut said different. The key had come with the deed, a large iron thing that looked as old as the barn itself. Buck fitted it into the padlock, half expecting it not to work. But the lock opened with a solid click that seemed too loud in the quiet morning. He unwrapped the chain, let it fall into the grass, and pulled open the doors. Light flooded in, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like spirits. Buck stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust, and felt his breath catch in his throat. The barn was packed floor to ceiling with treasures. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like ghosts in neat rows. Grates were stacked against the walls, some sealed, others cracked open to reveal glimpses of porcelain and crystal. Paintings leaned against every available surface, their frames catching the light. In the far corner, Buck saw trunks, the kind people used to travel with on ships, covered in faded travel stickers from places he'd never been. Paris, London, Rome. He stepped inside slowly, carefully, as if entering a church. The air smelled of old wood, dust, and something else, lavender maybe, or rosewater. A woman's scent, preserved somehow after all these years. Buck pulled the sheet off the nearest piece of furniture. It was a writing desk made from dark wood inlaid with mother of pearl. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail perfect. He opened a drawer and found it full of letters, tied with ribbon, the paper yellowed with age. But it was the painting that stopped him cold. It hung on the east wall, positioned to catch the morning light. Unlike the others, it wasn't covered. The frame was ornate, gilded, and the canvas itself was large, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. It showed a young woman in her 20s, dressed in the fashion of the 1880s, with a high-collared dress of deep blue silk, and her dark hair swept up in an elegant style. But it was her face that held Buck transfixed. She was beautiful, yes, but that wasn't it. There was something in her expression, a sadness around the eyes, a slight downturn to her mouth that spoke of loss. She looked like someone who'd loved deeply and lost everything. A small brass plate at the bottom of the frame bore a single name, Catherine. Buck stood before the portrait for a long time, unable to look away. He'd seen that expression before, worn it himself. The look of someone who'd made choices they couldn't take back, who carried regrets that time couldn't heal. He pulled over a crate, sat down, and just looked at her. Catherine. Who was she? Why had Theodore Marsh kept her portrait here, in this barn full of treasures? As his eyes adjusted further to the light, Buck noticed other things. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every object. They were all from the same era, the 1880s and 90s. This wasn't just a random collection. This was a life carefully preserved. Theodore Marsh hadn't been storing valuables. He'd been keeping memories. Buck moved through the barn slowly, uncovering more pieces of the puzzle. There were photographs in silver frames showing a grand house he didn't recognize, groups of people in formal dress, their faces serious as they stared into the camera. There were books, hundreds of them, their leather bindings still intact. There were clothes in trunks, still wrapped in tissue paper, women's dresses, men's suits, all from that same distant era. And everywhere, woven through it all, were traces of Catherine. Her face appeared in other photographs. A silk scarf that might have been hers lay folded in a drawer. A leather journal. The pages filled with a woman's handwriting spoke of gardens and music and love. Buck picked up the journal carefully, his rough hands almost afraid to touch something so delicate. The entries were dated 1889. He read one at random. Theodore came by again today. Mama says I shouldn't encourage him, that his work keeps him traveling too much for a proper courtship. But when he looks at me, I feel seen in a way I've never felt before. He speaks of art and beauty and making something that will last. I think perhaps he sees me as one of his treasures, something precious to be preserved. I should find this insulting, but I don't. I find it rather wonderful. Buck closed the journal gently, set it back where he'd found it. The pieces were coming together now, forming a story both beautiful and tragic. Theodore Marsh had loved Catherine, had loved her enough to build this shrine to their time together. But something had happened, something that ended their story and left Marsh clinging to these memories for the rest of his life. The watch in Buck's pocket suddenly felt heavier. Time is the only wealth we truly possess. Had Marsh written that before or after he lost Catherine? Had he understood even then that all his treasures meant nothing compared to the time he could have spent with the woman he loved? Buck stood up, moved back to the portrait. The morning sun had shifted, and now Catherine's face was fully illuminated. Looking at her, Buck thought of his own Catherine, his daughter named after his wife's grandmother. How old would she be now? 48? 49. Did she ever think of him? Did she hate him for leaving? He'd told himself for years that walking away had been the right choice, that she'd been better off without him. But standing here, surrounded by the evidence of Theodore Marsh's eternal regret, Buck wasn't so sure anymore. A sound outside made him turn. Hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching fast. Buck moved to the door, his old instincts from Vietnam kicking in. Through the gap he saw them, 4 men on horseback, riding hard up the rise. They didn't look friendly. The lead rider was a big man, maybe 40, with a thick black beard and eyes like chips of stone. He pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet from the barn and dismounted with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. You Buck Harmon?" The man called out. "I am," Buck said, stepping into the doorway but not moving beyond it. "Something I can do for you?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Name's Garrett Cole. That barn you're standing in? It belongs to me." Buck felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Got a deed that says different." "That deed's worthless," Cole said. He pulled a paper from his pocket. "This here's a bill of sale, signed by Theodore Marsh himself, before he disappeared. He sold me this barn and everything in it 7 years ago. Been trying to track down the deed ever since." Buck looked at the paper. It looked official enough, but something felt wrong. Theodore Marsh wouldn't have sold this barn, not with Catherine's portrait inside, not with all these memories preserved so carefully, if you owned it, Buck said slowly. "Why didn't you just break the lock?" Cole's smile faded. "Didn't have the key, and the county sheriff's a stickler for property rights. But now you've opened it up for me, so I'll thank you to step aside and let me claim what's mine." The 3 men with Cole spread out, flanking their leader. Their hands rested on their gun belts. Buck recognized the stance. They were prepared for trouble, maybe even hoping for it. Buck's mind raced. He didn't want to fight. He was 68 years old, unarmed except for a pocket knife, and outnumbered 4-1. But something in him refused to step aside. Catherine's portrait was in there, her journal, her memories, her whole life preserved by a man who'd loved her. Buck couldn't just hand that over to men who'd probably sell it all for cash. "I'll need to verify your claim with the county recorder," Buck said, keeping his voice steady. "Until then, this barn stays locked." Cole's expression darkened. "Old man, you're making a mistake." "Wouldn't be my first," Buck said. "But this barn's mine until someone proves otherwise. Now I suggest you boys ride on back to wherever you came from, and we'll sort this out proper and legal." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cole nodded slowly. "All right, old-timer, we'll do it your way. For now, but I'll be back. And next time I won't be asking so polite." He remounted, and the 4 men rode off, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the air like a warning. Buck watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline working through his system. He turned back to look at Catherine's portrait. "What have I gotten myself into?" he murmured. The painted woman looked back at him, her sad eyes seeming to say something that matters. "For the first time in a very long time, you found something that matters." Buck spent the rest of that day securing the barn. He bought a new chain and padlock at the general store in Cutter's Bend, heavier than the old one, and made sure every window was latched tight from inside. He didn't think Garrett Cole would wait long before making another move, and Buck wanted to be ready. That evening, he sat with Sam on the ranch house porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Buck had told him everything, about the barn, the treasures, Cole's claim. Sam listened quietly, the way he always did, then packed tobacco into his pipe and lit it with a wooden match. The sweet smoke drifted between them. "You could walk away," Sam said finally. "Whatever's in that barn, it's probably worth more trouble than it's worth. Cole's got a reputation. He doesn't lose graceful." "I know," Buck said. "But there's something about it, Sam. That portrait, those letters. It's like looking at my own life from the outside. A man who loved someone and lost her, who spent the rest of his days holding on to memories because that's all he had left." Sam nodded slowly. "You're thinking about Caroline. It wasn't a question." Sam was one of the few people who knew about Buck's daughter, about the choice he'd made 40 years ago. Buck had told him one night years back when the whiskey had loosened his tongue and the loneliness had become too heavy to carry alone. "Every day," Buck admitted. "But especially now, what if I could find her, Sam? What if it's not too late to—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. To what? Apologize? Make it right? Sam drew on his pipe. "Buck, some things can't be fixed. You know that. But that doesn't mean they can't be faced." Buck looked at his weathered hands. Maybe that's what Theodore Marsh was doing. Maybe he couldn't fix what happened with Catherine, but he could face it. Keep her memory alive. Honor what they had, even if it was brief. "And maybe," Sam said quietly, "you're meant to finish what he started. Find out what really happened to him, Make sure his story doesn't just fade away. The next morning, Buck rode into town early. The county recorder's office was a small building next to the courthouse, run by a woman named Martha Hendricks, who'd been keeping records for 30 years. If anyone could verify Cole's claim, it would be her. Martha was a stern woman, with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked at Buck over her spectacles as he explained what he needed. "Theodore Marsh," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Haven't heard that name in a while." "Hold on." She disappeared into the back room, and Buck could hear her moving through filing cabinets. When she returned, she carried a thick folder. "Here's what I have. Property records for the Marsh estate. The main house, the grounds, and 3 outbuildings, including a storage barn." She ran her finger down a page. "There's no record of any sale. The property passed to the estate when Marsh disappeared. Been in probate ever since, waiting for heirs to claim it. What about a bill of sale to a man named Garrett Cole?" Buck asked. Martha's expression hardened. "If such a document existed, it would have been filed with this office. I have no record of any transaction involving Theodore Marsh's property and Garrett Cole." She looked at Buck directly. "Cole's been sniffing around Marsh's estate for years, trying to find a way to claim it. If he showed you a bill of sale, I'd bet my last dollar it's a forgery." Buck felt something loosen in his chest. "So the deed I won is legitimate." Marsh did give that deed to someone years ago, a young man who'd helped him catalog some of his collection. "I remember processing the transfer. But I don't know how it ended up in a poker game in Cheyenne." She closed the folder. "Whatever's in that barn is legally yours now, Buck, but I'd watch my back if I were you." And Cole doesn't take kindly to being thwarted. Buck thanked her and left, his mind churning. So Cole had lied, tried to intimidate him into giving up the barn. That told Buck something important. Whatever was inside was valuable enough for a man to risk fraud to obtain it. He spent the afternoon at the barn, this time bringing supplies, an oil lamp, a notebook, a pencil. He wanted to catalog what was there, try to piece together Theodore Marsh's story. He started with the trunks in the corner. The first held clothing, all carefully packed. Men's suits from the 1880s, shirts with detachable collars, silk cravats. The second trunk was full of papers, receipts, letters from art dealers, shipping manifests for pieces Marsh had acquired from Europe. But it was the third trunk that stopped Buck cold. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a wooden box. Buck opened it carefully. Inside lay a collection of military medals, Union Army, Civil War era. There was a Medal of Honor, its blue ribbon faded but still intact. Beneath the medals was a photograph of a young man in uniform, barely 20 years old. Buck recognized the eyes, the same eyes that had commissioned Catherine's portrait years later. Theodore Marsh had been a soldier. Buck picked up the Medal of Honor, felt its weight in his palm. He knew what these medals meant, the kind of action required to earn them. Marsh had seen combat, had faced death, had probably killed men. And then he'd come home and tried to build a life, tried to surround himself with beauty and art and love, just like Buck had tried to do. A folded letter lay beneath the medals. The paper was brittle with age, but Buck opened it carefully. The handwriting was bold, masculine. Marsh's own hand, Buck thought. The letter was dated 1890, addressed to no one in particular. It read like a confession. "I have tried to outrun the war, but it follows me like a shadow. Every night I see their faces, the men I killed, the friends I lost. Catherine tells me I cry out in my sleep, thrash about as if still dodging bullets. She holds me until I'm quiet, never asking questions, never demanding explanations. She is too good for me, too pure for a man with blood on his hands. And yet she loves me. God help me, she loves me, and I do not know what I have done to deserve such grace." Buck's hands trembled as he set the letter down. It was like reading his own thoughts, written by someone else's hand, 40 years before Buck had even faced his own war. The same guilt, the same fear of contaminating something pure with the darkness inside. He thought of Sarah, Caroline's mother. She'd loved him too, had tried to hold him through the nightmares. But Buck had pushed her away, built walls she couldn't climb. And when she died bringing Caroline into the world, Those walls had only gotten higher. Buck sat there in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by Theodore Marsh's memories, and felt tears sting his eyes for the first time in decades. Here was proof that he wasn't alone, that another man had walked this same dark path. But where Buck had run, Marsh had stayed, had fought to keep Catherine in his life, to hold on to love even when he felt unworthy of it. What had happened then? Why had Marsh ended up alone, with only memories in a barn? Buck carefully rewrapped the medals, closed the trunk. He needed to know the rest of the story, not just for Theodore Marsh, but for himself. Because somewhere in this collection of preserved moments was a lesson about love, about regret, about whether it was ever truly too late to change course. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Buck locked the barn, climbed onto Rufus, and started the ride back to Dusty Ridge. But his mind stayed in that barn, with a young soldier's confession, and a portrait of a woman whose sad eyes seemed to understand everything Buck had never been able to say. The next few days fell into a pattern. Buck worked the ranch from dawn until mid-afternoon, then rode to the barn to continue his exploration. Each trunk, each crate, each painting revealed more pieces of Theodore Marsh's life. But the story remained incomplete, like a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. On the fourth day, Buck found the engagement ring. It was in a velvet box, tucked into the corner of a drawer in Catherine's writing desk. The ring itself was beautiful, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds set in gold. But what struck Buck was the note folded beneath it. The handwriting was different from the other letters he'd seen, sharper, more angular. A man's hand, but not Theodore's. Buck unfolded it carefully. "Catherine, your father and I have discussed this matter at length. Theodore Marsh may have money and refinement, but his past is unsuitable for our family. We cannot allow you to marry a man so damaged by war, so haunted by violence. You deserve better than a life spent soothing a soldier's nightmares. Return his ring. End this engagement. We have arranged a match with Jonathan Bradford, a solid man from a good family, untouched by the ugliness of war. This is for your own good." Your Uncle Robert Buck read the note twice, then set it down next to the ring. So that was it. Catherine's family had intervened, forced her to break the engagement. They'd seen Theodore's war wounds, not the kind that showed on the body, but the deeper kind that never healed, and decided he wasn't good enough for their daughter. Buck understood that judgment intimately. Hadn't he made the same choice himself? Decided he was too damaged to be a father, too broken to deserve love. But the ring was here, in the barn, never sent back. That meant something. Buck searched through more drawers, more boxes, looking for the rest of the story. He found it an hour later, a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, all addressed to Theodore Marsh, all marked "Return to Sender." He opened the first one carefully. The date was 3 weeks after the note from Catherine's uncle. "My dearest Theodore, I do not care what my family says. I do not care about their arrangements or their prejudices. You are the man I love, war wounds and all. Meet me at the old chapel on Miller's Ridge tomorrow at sunset. We will marry there, with or without their blessing, and leave this place together. Bring only what you need. Our life begins tomorrow. All my love, Catherine." Buck's heart pounded as he reached for the next letter. It was dated 2 days later. "Theodore, where were you? I waited at the chapel until midnight. Did my uncle intercept my first letter? I'm writing this in secret and will post it myself. Please, my love, send word. Tell me you still want this. Tell me you haven't been swayed by their poison. I am yours, completely and eternally. Catherine." The third letter was dated a week later, the handwriting more frantic. "I have received no response to my letters. My father says you have left Wyoming, gone back east without a word. I cannot believe this. I will not believe you would abandon me without explanation. Please, Theodore, if you receive this, come for me. I will wait. I will always wait. Catherine." There were 7 more letters, each more desperate than the last, each returned, unopened. Buck could barely stand to read them. The pain in those words, the confusion, the betrayal, the slow death of hope, it was unbearable. The final letter was dated 6 months after the first. The handwriting was controlled now, almost cold. "I understand. Your silence is answer enough. My family was right about you. You are too broken to love anyone properly. I have accepted Jonathan Bradford's proposal. We will marry in the spring. Do not contact me again. I hope you find whatever peace you are seeking. Catherine. Buck set the letters down, his hands shaking. What had happened? Why hadn't Theodore gone to the chapel? Why hadn't he responded to Catherine's letters? He stood up, paced the length of the barn, trying to make sense of it. Theodore had kept everything, the ring, the letters, the portrait. He'd built this shrine to their love. That wasn't the action of a man who'd simply walked away. Something had prevented him from meeting Catherine that night. Something had kept him from responding to her letters. But what? Buck was so lost in thought that he almost didn't hear the horses approaching. When he did, he moved quickly to the door, positioning himself where he could see out but remain mostly hidden. It was Cole again, but this time he'd brought more men, at least 8 riders. They stopped in front of the barn, and Cole dismounted slowly, deliberately. "Harmon," he called out. "I know you're in there. Time to stop playing games." Buck stepped into the doorway. "This is private property, Cole. You're trespassing." Cole smiled, but his eyes were hard. "See, that's where you're wrong. I've done some research, talked to some lawyers. That barn's in probate, which means it's not really yours until the estate is settled. And I've filed a claim as a creditor. Says here Marsh owed me money for services rendered, so I've got as much right to this barn as you do." "Martha Hendricks says otherwise," Buck replied. "Martha Hendricks isn't a judge. But I know one who might see things my way, especially after I explain how a drifter cowboy is squatting on valuable estate property." Cole took a step forward. "Now you can make this easy or hard. Easy is you walk away right now, and I forget we ever had this conversation. Hard is, well, hard involves the sheriff, lawyers, and a lot of trouble for a man your age." Buck's jaw tightened. He'd dealt with bullies before, in the army, in bars, on various ranches, where men thought age meant weakness. They were always the same, loud, aggressive, counting on intimidation to get what they wanted. "I'm not walking away," Buck said quietly. "Whatever Marsh left in this barn, he left it for a reason. I'm going to honor that." Cole's expression darkened. "You're making a big mistake, old man." "Maybe," Buck said. "But it's mine to make." For a long moment the two men stared at each other. Then Cole nodded slowly, remounted his horse. "We'll see how long your courage lasts," he said. "When you're sitting in a jail cell or lying in a hospital bed, wondering if your pride was worth it." He wheeled his horse around, and the group rode off, leaving Buck standing in the doorway with his heart hammering in his chest. He knew he should be frightened. 8 men against 1, with Cole clearly willing to escalate things. But instead, Buck felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Theodore Marsh's story mattered. Catherine's pain mattered. The truth of what had happened between them mattered. And maybe, just maybe, if Buck could uncover that truth, he could find a way to face his own. He went back inside, picked up Catherine's letters, and read them again. Somewhere in this barn was the answer to what had happened. Theodore had preserved everything so carefully. There had to be a reason, a message he was trying to send across the years. Buck just had to find it. As evening fell, he lit the oil lamp and continued his search. Outside, Rufus waited patiently, occasionally braying to remind Buck he was there. The old mule seemed to understand that something important was happening, that his master had finally found something worth fighting for, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, Garrett Cole and his men were planning their next move. Buck spent Sunday morning at the Cutter's Bend Library, a small building that smelled of old paper and dust. The librarian, a thin woman named Helen, who'd lived in Wyoming her whole life, directed him to the newspaper archives stored in the basement. "What year are you looking for?" she asked. 1890, Buck said. "October, if you have it." Helen raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She led him downstairs, showed him where the bound volumes were kept, then left him alone with the desk lamp and his curiosity. Buck paged through the Cutter's Bend Gazette, October 1890, looking for anything that might explain what had happened the night Theodore was supposed to meet Catherine at the chapel. The first week yielded nothing but advertisements and local gossip. But on October 19th, Buck found it. The headline read, "Art dealer injured in robbery attempt." Buck's hands trembled as he read the article. Theodore Marsh, respected art dealer and veteran, was severely injured Thursday evening when 3 men attempted to rob him outside his residence. Mr. Marsh sustained a gunshot, wound to the chest and head injuries. Dr. William Hensley reports his condition is grave. The assailants fled on horseback and remain at large. Sheriff's Department is investigating. Thursday evening. The same night Catherine had waited at the chapel. Theodore hadn't abandoned her. He'd been fighting for his life. Buck kept reading, flipping through subsequent editions. October 22nd, Marsh clings to life. October 26th, art dealer remains unconscious. November 2nd, Marsh awakens but suffers memory loss. That last article was longer, more detailed. Dr. Hensley was quoted extensively. Mr. Marsh has regained consciousness but appears to have suffered significant trauma to his head. He does not remember the attack or the days leading up to it. His memory may return with time, or it may not. In such cases, the mind protects itself by blocking out painful experiences. Buck sat back, the pieces falling into place. Theodore had woken up not remembering Catherine, not remembering their plan to elope. By the time his memory might have returned, Catherine had already married Jonathan Bradford. And Theodore, broken, guilty, unable to forgive himself for failing to meet her, had spent the rest of his life preserving the memories he'd lost, trying to piece together what he'd forgotten. It was heartbreaking, and it was painfully familiar. Buck climbed the stairs, found Helen at the front desk. "Were you living in Cutter's Bend in 1890? He asked. "Heavens, no. I was born in 1920, but my grandmother was here. She told stories." Helen studied Buck's face. "This is about Theodore Marsh, isn't it? And his barn." "It is. Did your grandmother ever mention him?" Helen was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "She said he was a tragic figure, a man who'd loved and lost, who never quite recovered. After that attack, he was never the same, became reclusive, paranoid. Built that barn to store his most precious possessions because he didn't trust keeping them at the mansion. Grandmother said he was trying to preserve something, memories maybe, or just proof that love had once existed in his life." "What happened to Catherine?" Buck asked. "The woman he was supposed to marry." "I don't know her name," Helen said. "But grandmother mentioned Marsh had been engaged once. The woman married someone else, had a family. Marsh never married at all. He'd see her in town sometimes," grandmother said, and the pain in his eyes was terrible to witness. Buck felt a weight settle in his chest. Theodore had remembered eventually then, had spent years seeing Catherine with another man, raising children that should have been theirs. No wonder he disappeared 7 years ago. The pain must have finally become too much to bear. "Thank you," Buck said quietly. He left the library, stepped out into the cool autumn air. The sun was bright, but Buck felt cold inside. He thought about Theodore Marsh, spending decades unable to reach the woman he loved, unable to explain what had happened. And Catherine, thinking she'd been abandoned, building a life with a man she didn't love, while the man she did love suffered in silence. It was senseless, tragic, a waste of 2 lives that could have been beautiful together. Buck mounted Rufus and rode toward the barn, his mind churning. He needed to find more, needed to know how the story ended, because somewhere in that ending might be the lesson he was meant to learn. When he reached the barn, he found someone waiting. She was an old woman, maybe 70, sitting in a buggy pulled by a single horse. She wore a simple dress and a shawl despite the warm afternoon, and her white hair was pulled back in a neat bun. When she saw Buck approach, she climbed down carefully, using a cane for support. "Mr. Harmon?" she called out. Buck dismounted, approached cautiously. "I am. Can I help you, ma'am?" "My name is Eleanor Bradford," she said. "My mother was Catherine Aldridge, Catherine Bradford, after she married my father. I understand you've come into possession of my grandfather Marsh's barn." Buck felt his heart skip. "Your grandfather?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Not by blood, but that's how I always thought of him. May we talk? I have some things to tell you about Theodore Marsh, things I think you need to hear." Buck unlocked the barn, helped Eleanor inside. He brought out 2 chairs, positioned them near Catherine's portrait. Eleanor looked up at the painting and tears filled her eyes. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my mother. I was 10 years old when she died, but I remember her face. The sadness in her eyes. I always wondered where it came from." She looked at Buck. "Now I know." "Tell me," Buck said. "Please." Eleanor took a deep breath. "My mother married my father in the spring of 1891. She was a dutiful wife, bore him 3 children, managed his household. But she was never happy. Anyone could see that. My father knew it too, though he never spoke of it. When I was 7, I found letters hidden in her room. Love letters from Theodore Marsh, written before they were separated. I didn't understand them then, but I kept them after she died. Years later, I read them properly. I learned about their engagement, about the night he was supposed to meet her at the chapel. Did you know what happened that night?" Buck asked. "Not until much later. When I was 20, I sought out Mr. Marsh. He was living alone by then, in his mansion, surrounded by his art. I told him who I was, Catherine's daughter. He wept when he saw me, said I had her eyes. He told me everything. The attack, the memory loss, waking up weeks later to find Catherine married. He'd tried to contact her once to explain, but she'd refused to see him. Said it was too late, that she'd made her choices and had to live with them." Eleanor paused, wiped her eyes. "Mr. Marsh asked me to visit him regularly, and I did. For 20 years, until 7 years ago when he disappeared. He became like a grandfather to me, told me stories, taught me about art, listened to my troubles. And he told me about this barn, about the treasures inside. Said they were Catherine's story, preserved for when someone was meant to find them." She looked at Buck directly. "I think you're that someone, Mr. Harmon. I think you're meant to understand what Theodore couldn't tell Catherine, that love doesn't end just because circumstances separate us. That some bonds are stronger than time or distance or even death." Buck felt tears sting his eyes. Why didn't he just tell her? Why didn't he fight for her? "He tried," Eleanor said. "But Catherine was proud. She'd been hurt, humiliated. Sometimes pride is stronger than love. And by the time both of them realized what they'd lost, it was too late to get it back." Buck thought of Caroline, his daughter. Was it too late for them too? Or was there still time to bridge the 40 years between them? Eleanor reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope. "Before Mr. Marsh disappeared, he gave me this. Made me promise to give it to whoever found the barn. He said they'd understand what it meant." Buck took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a note in Theodore's handwriting. "The greatest tragedy isn't losing love. It's having the chance to reclaim it and choosing fear instead. Don't make my mistake." That evening, Buck sat in his bunkhouse with Theodore's note in his hands. Eleanor had left hours ago, but her words still echoed in his mind. "The greatest tragedy isn't losing love. It's having the chance to reclaim it and choosing fear instead." He thought about Caroline constantly now, couldn't push her from his thoughts. Where was she? What had her life been like? Did she ever wonder about the father who'd abandoned her? Buck stood, went to the old trunk beneath his cot. He hadn't opened it in years, afraid of what he'd find inside. But Theodore Marsh's story had given him courage, or maybe just shown him that avoiding pain didn't make it disappear. Inside the trunk were the few possessions Buck had kept from his old life. His discharge papers from Vietnam, a photograph of Sarah holding newborn Caroline, both of them looking at the camera with trust in their eyes. And buried at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a small music box. Buck lifted it carefully, his rough hands trembling. It was made of cherry wood, intricately carved, with a tiny brass key. He wound it slowly, and the mechanism inside began to play, a simple melody, sweet and pure. The music filled the small bunkhouse, and suddenly Buck was back in Montana, 39 years ago. Caroline was 9 months old, crying in her crib. Sarah had been dead for 6 months, and Buck was drowning in grief and fear. He'd found the music box at a mercantile, bought it on impulse, thinking maybe music would soothe his daughter. It had worked. Caroline would quiet when he played it, her small hands reaching toward the sound. Buck would sit beside her crib, winding the music box over and over, watching her eyes grow heavy with sleep. But then the nightmares had started, Vietnam coming back in full force, waking him screaming, drenched in sweat. He'd been afraid he'd hurt Caroline in his sleep, afraid the violence inside him would somehow infect her innocent life. So he'd left the music box behind when he walked away. Left everything behind. Now, holding it again, Buck felt the weight of all those lost years. Caroline would be 48 now. Maybe she had children of her own, grandchildren. Maybe she'd built a good life despite, or because of, his absence. Or maybe she'd spent her life wondering why her father hadn't loved her enough to stay. Buck set the music box down, picked up the photograph of Sarah and Caroline. Sarah's face was young, bright with hope and love. She'd believed in him, trusted him to be a good father. And he'd failed her, but it wasn't too late. Eleanor's words, Theodore's words, echoed again. Don't make my mistake. Buck pulled out paper and a pencil. His handwriting was clumsy, unpracticed, but he wrote slowly, carefully. Dear Caroline, I don't know if you'll want to hear from me. I don't know if you remember me at all, but I need you to know that leaving you was the worst mistake of my life. Not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you, wondered about you, regretted my choice. I told myself I was protecting you from my brokenness. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from the possibility of failing you the way I failed your mother. I was a coward. If you're willing to see me, I'm living at the Dusty Ridge Ranch outside Cutter's Bend, Wyoming. If you're not willing, I understand. But please know that you were loved, are loved, more than I ever knew how to say. Your father, Buck Harmon. He sealed the letter, addressed it to Caroline Harmon, Montana. He didn't have a specific address, but maybe the postmaster in the town where he'd left her could track her down. It was a slim hope, but it was something. The next morning, Buck rode into town early to post the letter. As he left the post office, he nearly collided with Sheriff Tom Brennan. Buck, the sheriff said, his expression serious. I need to talk to you. They walked to the sheriff's office, a small building with 2 cells in back. Brennan poured coffee, offered Buck a cup, then sat behind his desk with a heavy sigh. Garrett Cole's been filing complaints, Brennan said. Says you're trespassing on estate property, interfering with a legitimate creditor claim, threatening his men. That's a lie, Buck said flatly. I have a legal deed to that barn. Martha Hendricks confirmed it, and the only threatening has come from Cole and his thugs. Brennan nodded. I believe you. But Cole's got friends in high places, judges, lawyers, politicians. He's pushing for a court order to seize the barn until the estate's settled. Could take months, maybe years. So he's trying to tie me up in legal battles until I give up, Buck said. That's about the size of it. Brennan leaned forward. Buck, I know you're not a man who backs down, but you should know what you're up against. Cole doesn't just have money and connections. He's got muscle, too. Men who aren't afraid to get rough if the law doesn't work in their favor. I can handle myself, Buck said. Maybe 30 years ago, Brennan said gently. But you're not a young man anymore, neither am I. Sometimes knowing when to fold is the smartest play. Buck stood, set down his coffee cup. I appreciate the warning, Sheriff, but I'm seeing this through. He left before Brennan could respond, mounted Rufus, and rode toward the barn. As he approached, he saw immediately that something was wrong. The new padlock was broken, hanging loose from the chain. The barn doors stood open. Buck's heart hammered as he dismounted. He pulled the doors wide and stepped inside. The barn had been ransacked. Paintings were torn from their frames, furniture overturned, trunks emptied. Papers were scattered everywhere, torn and trampled. It looked like a tornado had swept through. But worst of all, Catherine's portrait was gone. Buck stood in the wreckage, rage and grief warring inside him. Cole had done this, had to be Cole. Taken what he couldn't legally claim, destroyed what he didn't value. Buck moved through the destruction, trying to assess what was missing. Most of the smaller valuables were gone. The silver, the jewelry, some of the paintings. But the furniture was still there, too big to move quickly, and most importantly, the trunks of papers and letters remained, though scattered. He spent the next 3 hours gathering what he could, separating the important from the damaged. As he worked, He found something that made him pause, a leather journal he hadn't seen before, tucked under an overturned cabinet. The journal was Theodore Marsh's, filled with entries spanning decades. Buck opened it to a random page, dated 1920. I saw Catherine today at the Mercantile. She is 60 now, still beautiful despite the years. Our eyes met for just a moment. I saw recognition there and pain, and something else. Regret, perhaps. I wanted to speak to her, to finally say all the things I've held inside for 30 years. But her husband was with her and her daughter, and it wasn't my place. It's never been my place. I've learned to live with this loneliness, this permanent ache. But some days it feels unbearable. Some days I wonder if disappearing entirely might be kinder than this half-life of glimpses and memories. Buck closed the journal, held it against his chest. He understood that loneliness, that permanent ache. He'd lived with it for 40 years. But he wasn't going to live with it anymore. He gathered the journal and the most important documents, loaded them onto Rufus. Then he rode straight to town, to the sheriff's office. I want to file charges, Buck told Brennan. Breaking and entering, theft, destruction of property. And I know exactly who did it. Brennan looked tired. Can you prove it was Cole? Not yet, Buck admitted. But I will. And when I do, he's going to answer for it. Buck, no, Buck said firmly. I'm not backing down, not from this. Those treasures belong to Theodore Marsh. They tell his story, and Catherine's story, and they matter. Someone needs to make sure their truth isn't buried under Cole's greed. Brennan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll open an investigation, but be careful, Buck. Cole's dangerous when he doesn't get his way. Buck left the sheriff's office with a sense of purpose burning in his chest. He'd spent 40 years running from confrontation, avoiding anything that might force him to face his failures. But Theodore Marsh's story and his own letter to Caroline had changed something fundamental inside him. It was time to stand his ground, time to fight for something that mattered, time to prove that some things, love, truth, legacy, were worth the risk. 3 days after the break-in, Buck received 2 pieces of mail that would change everything. The first arrived in the morning. Buck was mucking out Rufus's stall when Sam called out that the postman had left something at the main house. Buck walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans, expecting bills or advertisements. Instead, Sam handed him a telegram. Buck stared at it, his heart suddenly racing. Nobody sent telegrams anymore unless it was urgent. His hand shook slightly as he opened it. Letter received. Coming to Wyoming. Arrive Cutter's Bend, November 10th. We need to talk. Caroline. Buck read it 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. Caroline, his daughter, coming here in less than a week. Good news? Sam asked gently. Buck couldn't speak. He just handed Sam the telegram and sat down heavily on the porch steps. 40 years. 40 years of running, of avoiding, of telling himself it was too late, and now she was coming. This is good, Buck, Sam said. This is real good. What if she hates me? Buck's voice was rough. What if she's coming just to tell me face to face what a miserable father I was? Then you'll listen, Sam said, and you'll accept whatever she needs to say. But maybe, just maybe, she's coming because she wants to understand. Maybe she needs answers as much as you need forgiveness. Buck nodded, unable to trust his voice. He took the telegram back, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket next to Theodore's note. 2 pieces of paper, both offering him a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. The second piece of mail arrived that afternoon. Buck was at the barn trying to organize what remained after Cole's raid when he heard horses approaching. He tensed, ready for another confrontation, but it was Eleanor Bradford's buggy that came into view. She climbed down more quickly than last time, her face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Harmon, I found something important." Buck helped her inside, brought her a chair. Eleanor was breathing hard, her hands trembling as she pulled a sealed envelope from her bag. "After our last conversation, I went through my mother's things again," Eleanor said. "Things I inherited when she died. I found this hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry box. It's addressed to Theodore, but it was never sent. I think she wrote it shortly before she died. She handed Buck the envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed, but the seal had never been broken. Buck looked at Eleanor questioningly. "Open it," she said. "Theodore's gone. My mother's gone. Whatever secrets they kept, they don't matter anymore. Only the truth matters now." Buck carefully broke the seal, pulled out several sheets of paper covered in Catherine's elegant handwriting. The date at the top was January 1920. "My dearest Theodore," it began, "I am writing this letter knowing I will never have the courage to send it. The doctor has told me I have perhaps 6 months to live. Cancer, they call it, though the name matters less than the certainty. I am 60 years old, and I have lived a half-life. I need you to know the truth before I go. I knew about the attack. Not immediately, not while I waited at the chapel, not during those awful weeks when I wrote you letter after letter with no reply. But eventually, the truth reached me. My Uncle Robert told me, thinking it would bring me comfort. Instead, it destroyed what little hope I had left. You were shot trying to meet me, nearly died protecting what we had, and I, in my pride and hurt, married another man before you even woke up. I have never forgiven myself for that weakness. But there's more you never knew. More I never had. The courage to tell you, in the rare moments we passed each other on the street, our eyes meeting across an unbridgeable distance. I was with child when we were separated. Your child, a daughter born 7 months after I married Jonathan. He accepted her as his own, had no choice really, given the timing, but I named her Eleanor. Do you remember? You once told me, Eleanor means light, and that if we had a daughter, she should carry light into a dark world. She is your daughter, Theodore. She has your eyes, your gentle heart, your love of beauty. Every day I look at her and see what we could have been together. Every day I live with the knowledge that I denied you the chance to know your own child. Because I was too proud to seek you out, too afraid of what people would say. I am a coward. I always have been. I let my family dictate my choices, let fear override love. And now I'm dying with this secret, and you'll never know that the girl who visits you, who brings you comfort in your loneliness, is your own flesh and blood. Forgive me, Theodore. Forgive me for all of it, for doubting you, for marrying another, for stealing your child from you. I loved you then. I love you still. I have loved you every day of this wasted life. If there is an afterlife, I will find you there and finally tell you these truths face to face. Until then, I remain forever yours, Catherine. Buck's hands shook as he lowered the letter. He looked at Eleanor, saw tears streaming down her weathered face. I'm his daughter, she whispered. All those years I visited him, thinking he was just a kind old man who'd loved my mother. He was my father. Did he know? Buck asked gently. I don't think so. Catherine never sent the letter. Never told him. Eleanor wiped her eyes. But maybe he suspected. Maybe that's why he asked me to visit, why he was so kind to me. Maybe some part of him recognized his own blood. Buck thought about Theodore Marsh, living with such loneliness, not knowing that the daughter who brought him comfort was actually his child. It was almost too cruel to bear. There's something else, Eleanor said, her voice steadier now. She reached into her bag again, pulled out another document. After finding Catherine's letter, I went to the county records. Started tracing back, trying to understand everything. And I found this, the investigation report from Theodore's attack in 1890. She handed Buck a faded police report. He scanned it quickly, then stopped reading more carefully. 3 men had been questioned, but never charged due to lack of evidence. Their names were listed: Samuel Garrett, William Cole, and Robert Aldridge. Catherine's uncle, her own uncle, arranged the attack, Buck said, horror dawning. He tried to have Theodore killed. Eleanor nodded grimly. He didn't want Theodore marrying into the family, so he hired men to stop it. Samuel Garrett was Garrett Cole's great-grandfather. William Cole was his other great-grandfather. The families intermarried a generation later. Cole's been trying to get this barn because somewhere in here is proof of what his ancestors did. Theodore must have figured it out eventually, kept evidence. Buck's mind raced. That's why he disappeared 7 years ago. He finally had proof, was going to expose them, and Cole's family made him disappear, Eleanor finished. Just like they tried to in 1890. Buck stood up, began searching through the scattered papers with new urgency. If Theodore had kept evidence, it had to be here somewhere. And if Cole had ransacked the barn looking for it, that meant he hadn't found it yet. "Help me look," Buck said. "We need to find whatever Theodore kept hidden." They searched for an hour, going through every trunk, every box, every hiding place Buck could think of. Finally, Eleanor called out from the corner where Catherine's writing desk stood. "Here! There's a false bottom in this drawer." Buck rushed over. Together, they pried up the false bottom, revealing a small leather pouch. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear enough, showing 3 men outside Theodore's mansion the night of the attack. On the back of each photograph, Theodore had written names, dates, and a detailed account of how he'd eventually identified his attackers. There was also a sworn affidavit, signed by Theodore and witnessed by a judge, detailing his accusations and the evidence he'd gathered over 30 years. This could destroy Cole's family reputation, Eleanor breathed. "Put him in prison if there's any evidence he was involved in Theodore's disappearance." Buck carefully placed the photographs and affidavit back in the pouch. "We need to take this to Sheriff Brennan now." As they headed for the door, Buck saw riders approaching in the distance. Many riders, at least a dozen, moving fast. "Cole's men. They're coming for the evidence," Buck said. "They must have been watching, waiting for us to find it." Eleanor gripped her cane, her face pale but determined. "Then we make sure they don't get it." Buck looked around the barn, his mind working through options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But he'd been in worse situations in Vietnam. He'd survived then by using his head instead of his fists. It was time to prove that old soldiers never forget how to fight. They just choose their battles more carefully. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I need you to trust me. And I need you to be ready to ride that buggy faster than you ever have before." Buck had maybe 5 minutes before Cole's men reached the barn. His mind moved fast, assessing the situation with the cold clarity that came from decades-old training. He might be 68, but muscle memory never really faded. "Eleanor," he said calmly, "take the evidence and ride for town. Don't stop for anything. Get to Sheriff Brennan. Tell him everything." "I can't leave you here alone," Eleanor protested. "You have to." Buck handed her the leather pouch. "This evidence is more important than me. It's Theodore's legacy. It's justice for him and Catherine. Now go." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. She tucked the pouch into her bag, climbed into her buggy, and snapped the reins. The horse took off at a gallop, heading east toward town on a path that would keep her clear of Cole's approaching men. Buck watched her go, then turned back to the barn. He had to buy her time, had to make sure Cole's men didn't catch up before she reached the sheriff. He moved quickly, his old infantry training taking over. First, he led Rufus out of the barn, sent the mule running with a slap to his haunches. No sense letting the stubborn animal get caught in whatever was about to happen. Rufus brayed indignantly, but trotted off toward Dusty Ridge. Then Buck surveyed his defensive position. The barn had 2 doors, the main entrance and a smaller side door. Windows on 3 sides, high up, too small for a man to climb through. The walls were thick timber, solid. Good cover. Inside, Buck grabbed the heaviest furniture he could move quickly, dragged it to block the side door completely. That left only one entrance to defend. He positioned himself behind an overturned table near the main doors, giving him a clear line of sight while providing cover. He had no weapons, had sworn off guns after Vietnam, but there were tools. A pitchfork leaning against the wall, a heavy shovel, a length of chain from the padlock. Not much, but enough to make a stand if it came to that. Buck's heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He thought about Theodore Marsh facing 3 attackers in 1890, nearly dying because he'd dared to love someone. He thought about Catherine's letter, the 40 years she'd spent in regret. He thought about Caroline's telegram, arriving in less than a week. He couldn't die here, not now, not when he finally had a chance to make things right. The riders approached, their horses' hoofbeats loud in the afternoon quiet. Buck counted them through a gap in the door, 12 men, all armed. Cole dismounted first, his face hard with determination. "Harmon!" Cole shouted. "I know you're in there. Send out the old woman and whatever she's carrying, and we'll let you walk away." Buck stayed silent, calculating distances, angles of approach. In Vietnam, they taught him that silence was its own weapon. Let the enemy's imagination work against them. "I saw her ride off," Cole continued. "We'll catch her before she reaches town. But it'll be easier if you cooperate now." Still Buck said nothing. He could hear Cole's frustration building, heard him conferring with his men in low voices. Then Cole tried a different approach. "Listen, old man, I don't want anyone to get hurt, but my family's reputation is on the line here. Whatever lies Theodore Marsh wrote down, they're not going to see the light of day. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to come out with your hands up, tell me where that evidence went. And then we're all going to have a conversation about how this never happened." Buck finally spoke, his voice carrying clear and strong. "Your great-grandfathers tried to murder a good man because he loved someone they thought wasn't good enough for him. They failed then. You're going to fail now. Is that so?" Cole's voice hardened. "You think one old cowboy can stop 12 armed men?" "No," Buck said. "But I can slow you down long enough for Eleanor Bradford to reach the sheriff. And once that evidence is in official hands, your family's legacy is over." He heard Cole curse, heard rapid conversation among the men. Then footsteps, spreading out, surrounding the barn. Buck's mind flashed to a patrol in the Mekong Delta, 1969. Surrounded by enemy forces, outnumbered 3-1. His sergeant, a man named Davis from Tennessee, had looked at Buck and the others and said, "We don't have to win. We just have to survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Stay smart, stay low, make every move count." Davis had gotten them all out alive that day. Buck intended to honor that lesson now. The first man tried the main door, pushing it open slowly. Buck waited until he'd committed to entering, then kicked the door hard. It slammed into the man's face, sent him stumbling backward with a cry of pain. "Next one through gets worse," Buck called out. More curses. Then the sound of glass breaking, someone throwing rocks through the high windows. Trying to distract him, create multiple points of concern, Buck didn't take the bait. He kept his eyes on the main entrance, his ears tracking movement outside. 2 men at the back, trying the blocked side door. 3 circling around, looking for another way in. The rest near Cole, planning. Time stretched out. Buck's knees ached from crouching, his back protested, but he held his position. How long had Eleanor been riding? 10 minutes, 15. The town was 6 miles away. Even at a hard gallop, she'd need at least 20 minutes to reach the sheriff's office. He had to hold for at least 10 more minutes. Cole's voice again, closer now. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Harmon. We've got all day. You've got a limited water supply and no backup coming. Eventually you'll have to come out." Buck thought about Theodore's war medals, still in their trunk somewhere in this barn, a Medal of Honor. That meant Theodore had faced impossible odds and somehow prevailed, had found courage when courage seemed impossible. "Cole!" Buck called out. "Your great-grandfathers were cowards who attacked an unarmed man at night. Is that the legacy you want to protect? Violence and cowardice?" "My family built this territory," Cole shot back. "We made this land what it is. I won't let some dead art dealer's lies destroy that." "They're not lies," Buck said, "and deep down you know it. That's why you're so desperate to bury them." A long silence. Then Cole's voice, lower, more dangerous. "All right, old man. You want to play hero? Let's see how long you last." Buck heard orders being given, heard men moving with purpose. Then the smell hit him. Kerosene. They were going to try to smoke him out. His mind raced through options. The barn was old, the wood dry. A fire would spread fast, fill the interior with smoke long before the walls caught. He'd have maybe 5 minutes before he'd be forced out, right into Cole's hands. But there was another option. Risky, probably foolish, but maybe his only chance. Buck moved quickly to Theodore's trunk, the one with the war medals. He pulled out the uniform jacket folded beneath them, Union Army, pristine despite its age, lovingly preserved. He put it on, It was tight across the shoulders, but it fit well enough. Then he did something that felt like both sacrilege and honor. He pinned Theodore's Medal of Honor to the jacket's chest. He wasn't trying to steal valor. He was carrying forward a legacy. Theodore had fought for love and lost. Buck was fighting for truth. They were the same battle, separated by time but united in purpose. Smoke began seeping under the door, wisping through gaps in the walls. Buck covered his nose and mouth with a kerchief, waited. His eyes watered, his throat burned, but he held his ground. He thought about Caroline's telegram, thought about Sam's words. Sometimes knowing when to fold is the smartest play. But this wasn't poker. This was about standing up for something bigger than himself. The smoke thickened. Buck's lungs protested, his eyes streaming. He could hear Cole and his men waiting outside, ready to grab him the moment he stumbled out choking. But then, through the smoke and tears, Buck heard something else, something beautiful. Sirens, horse hooves, shouting voices, official, authoritative. Sheriff Brennan's voice cut through the chaos. "This is the law. Everyone drop your weapons and step away from the barn." Buck allowed himself a small smile. Eleanor had made it. The cavalry had arrived. He pushed open the door, stumbled out into clean air, gasping. Through blurred vision, he saw Sheriff Brennan and 6 deputies, all armed, facing down Cole and his men. Eleanor stood beside the sheriff's horse, the leather pouch clutched to her chest. Cole's face was a mask of fury and defeat. He looked at Buck, at the Union Army jacket, at the Medal of Honor gleaming in the afternoon sun. "That doesn't belong to you," Cole said. Buck straightened, despite the smoke inhalation, despite his aching body. "No," he agreed. "It belonged to a man who fought for love and honor and truth, a man your family tried to destroy. I'm just making sure his fight wasn't for nothing." Brennan stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "Garrett Cole, you're under arrest for arson, attempted assault and conspiracy. Based on evidence Mrs. Bradford has provided, we'll also be reopening the investigation into Theodore Marsh's disappearance 7 years ago." As the deputies moved in to arrest Cole and his men, Buck caught Eleanor's eye. She was smiling through tears, and he understood. They'd done it. They'd honored Theodore and Catherine's memory. They'd brought truth into the light. Buck carefully removed the Medal of Honor, folded the uniform jacket with reverence. He'd returned them to their proper place in the barn, cleaned and preserved. But for one moment, he'd carried Theodore Marsh's courage forward, completed a mission that had started over a century ago. And now, with Cole defeated and justice served, Buck could focus on the mission that truly mattered, preparing to face his daughter, to finally speak the truths he should have spoken 40 years ago. He had 4 days until Caroline arrived, 4 days to find the courage Theodore Marsh never had, to choose love over fear, truth over pride, redemption over regret. Buck looked at the barn, smoke still drifting from its interior, and made himself a promise. He would restore it. Every painting, every treasure, every piece of Theodore and Catherine's story. He would make it whole again, just as he prayed his daughter might help him become whole again. The morning of November 10th, Buck woke before dawn. He'd barely slept, his mind churning through everything he wanted to say to Caroline, everything he needed to explain. But every rehearsed speech sounded hollow, inadequate. He cleaned the bunkhouse, shaved carefully, put on his best shirt, which wasn't saying much. Then he sat on the porch steps with the music box in his hands, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Sam found him there an hour later. The old rancher sat down beside him without a word, and they watched the light change together. "You ready?" Sam finally asked. "No," Buck said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." Sam nodded. "That's all any of us can do." The train from Montana was due at 1 o'clock. Buck rode Rufus into town at noon, arriving at the small station with an hour to spare. He tied the mule to a post, then paced the platform until the station master gave him a concerned look. "Expecting someone important?" the man asked. "My daughter," Buck said. The words felt strange in his mouth. "Haven't seen her in 40 years. The station master's expression softened. "Well then, Hope it goes well for you, Mr. Harmon. Buck nodded, resumed his pacing. The music box felt heavy in his pocket, a talisman against fear. At 1:15, the train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and a screech of brakes. Buck's heart hammered so hard he could barely breathe. Passengers began disembarking. A cattle buyer he recognized, a traveling salesman, a young family with squalling children. Then she stepped down. Buck knew her instantly, though 40 years had transformed her from a child into a woman. She was tall, like Sarah had been, with dark hair going grey at the temples. She wore a simple traveling dress and carried a single carpet bag. But it was her eyes that stopped Buck's heart, Sarah's eyes, looking at him with a mixture of apprehension and something else he couldn't quite name. "Buck Harmon?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. "Caroline." Buck's voice cracked on her name. "Thank you for coming." They stood there on the platform, 10 feet apart, neither quite knowing how to bridge the distance. Finally, Buck gestured toward the town. "There's a cafe where we could talk, if you're hungry." Caroline nodded. "All right." They walked in silence through Cutter's Bend, Buck acutely aware of curious glances from townspeople who recognized him. The cafe was quiet at this hour, and they took a table in the back corner. Buck ordered coffee for them both, though he knew he wouldn't be able to drink it. When the waitress left, Caroline spoke first. "Your letter came as quite a shock. I'd assumed you were dead. Everyone assumed you were dead." Buck winced. "I'm sorry, I should have let you know I was alive, but I was ashamed." "I'm ashamed." Caroline studied him, her expression unreadable. "Do you know what it was like, growing up without a father? Having everyone whisper about the man who abandoned me?" "I can imagine," Buck said quietly. "No," Caroline said, her voice harder now. "You can't. You chose to leave. I didn't get a choice." The words hit Buck like physical blows, but he didn't look away. "You're right. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting you from my brokenness, from the nightmares and the anger. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I was afraid of failing you the way I felt I'd failed your mother. My mother died bringing me into the world," Caroline said. "That wasn't your failure. But I blamed you anyway." Buck forced the words out, each one like pulling splinters. "Every time I looked at you, I saw her, and the pain was unbearable, so I ran. Left you with strangers and told myself it was for your own good." Caroline's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "I needed you. I was 8 years old, and I needed my father." "I know." Buck's hands trembled on the table. "And I failed you. There's no excuse for that, no justification. I can only tell you the truth. Not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you, regretted my choice, wondered what kind of person you'd become." "What kind of person did you think I'd become?" Caroline asked. "Without you there to guide me?" Buck met her eyes. "Better than me, stronger. Someone who wouldn't run when things got hard." "Well, you were right about that." Caroline's voice softened slightly. "I had to be strong. Mrs. Henderson, the woman you left me with, did her best, but she was old and ill. I learned to take care of myself early. Married at 19, had 3 children, lost my husband to influenza 10 years ago. Raised those children alone, worked as a school teacher to keep food on the table." She paused. "I survived, built a life, but there was always a hole where you should have been." Buck reached into his pocket, pulled out the music box. He set it on the table between them. Caroline stared at it, her composure finally cracking. "Is that—" "I bought it for you when you were 9 months old," Buck said. "You'd cry at night, and I'd play it until you fell asleep. I kept it all these years, a reminder of what I'd given up." Caroline picked up the music box with shaking hands, wound the key. The familiar melody filled the quiet cafe, and tears streamed down her face. "I remember this," she whispered. "I didn't think I did, but I remember. Someone playing music for me in the dark, making me feel safe." Buck's own eyes burned. "You were loved, Caroline. Even though I left, even though I was too broken to stay, you were loved." Caroline set the music box down, looked at Buck directly. "Then why did it take you 40 years to tell me that?" Buck had no good answer to Caroline's question. He sat there, an old man with weathered hands and too many regrets. searching for words that could bridge 40 years of absence. Fear, he finally said. Every year that passed made it harder to reach out. I convinced myself you were better off without me, that you'd built a good life, and my sudden appearance would only cause pain. I told myself a lot of lies, Caroline, because lies were easier than facing what I'd done. What changed? Caroline asked. Why now? Buck told her about Theodore Marsh's barn, about the portrait of Catherine, the letters, the love that had been destroyed by circumstance and pride. He told her about Eleanor, discovering too late that Theodore was her father, about the evidence, the confrontation with Cole, the fight to preserve a truth that mattered. I saw myself in Theodore's story, Buck said. The man who let fear and shame keep him from the people he loved, who preserved memories because he couldn't face the reality of connection. And I realized I was doing the same thing, keeping your music box, your mother's photograph, holding on to the past because I was too afraid to face the present. Caroline listened quietly, her fingers tracing the edges of the music box. When Buck finished, she was silent for a long moment. I have children, she finally said. 3 of them. Your grandchildren. Samuel is 28, teaches mathematics. Margaret is 25, married, expecting her first child. And Ruth is 22, studying to be a doctor. Buck felt something crack open in his chest. Grandchildren. He'd never even considered the possibility. He was too focused on his own loss to imagine what Caroline might have built. They've asked about you, Caroline continued. Their mysterious grandfather who disappeared. I never knew what to tell them. So I told them you died in the war. It seemed kinder than the truth. I understand, Buck said, but I couldn't let it go, Caroline said. Last year I started searching. Hired a detective to look through military records, death certificates, anything that might tell me what happened to Buck Harmon. He found you 3 months ago, alive, working on a ranch in Wyoming. I didn't know what to do with that information. Didn't know if I wanted to know why you'd let me believe you were dead. And then my letter arrived, Buck said. Caroline nodded. And I had to decide. Let the past stay buried, or face the man who abandoned me and ask why. Which did you choose? I'm here, aren't I? Caroline's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I'm here because my children deserve to know their grandfather if he's willing to be known. Because my daughter is about to have a baby, and I want that child to have as much family as possible. But mostly I'm here because... She stopped, swallowed hard. Because 40 years of anger is exhausting. And I need to know if there's any possibility of something else. Buck reached across the table, stopped just short of touching her hand. I can't undo the past. Can't give you back the childhood I stole from you. But if you'll let me, if you're willing to try, I'd like to be part of your life going forward. Part of your children's lives. I know I have no right to ask for that grace, but I'm asking anyway. Caroline looked at his outstretched hand, weathered and scarred. Then she reached into her own bag, pulled out a photograph. It showed 3 young people, 2 women and a man, smiling at the camera. These are your grandchildren, she said, setting it beside the music box. Samuel, Margaret, and Ruth, they're good people. Kind, smart, full of life. They're everything I hoped they'd be. Buck picked up the photograph, studied the faces. He could see Sarah in them, could see Caroline, could see the legacy that continued despite his absence. They're beautiful, he whispered. Margaret's baby is due in March, Caroline said. A boy. She's naming him Theodore after her great-grandfather, my father Jonathan's father. But she paused, met Buck's eyes. Maybe she'd consider making Harmon his middle name, if his actual great-grandfather earned that honor. Buck's vision blurred with tears. I would like that. Very much. Caroline finally took his hand, her grip firm. This won't be easy. There's 40 years of hurt between us. I can't promise I'll forgive everything quickly, or that there won't be anger and pain along the way. I know, Buck said, but I'm willing to try, Caroline continued. For my children's sake, for my grandchild's sake, and maybe for us too. Because I'm tired of carrying this anger, tired of the hole where my father should have been. Buck held her hand, this daughter who'd become a stranger, and felt something shift inside him. Not redemption exactly, he didn't deserve that. but possibility. A chance to be present for what remained of his life. A chance to know his grandchildren, to watch them grow, to finally be the man he should have been all along. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Caroline, thank you." She squeezed his hand once, then released it. "Now," she said, her tone becoming more practical, "tell me about this barn and these treasures, and explain why you're wearing bandages on your hands." Buck smiled despite his tears. She was her mother's daughter, capable, direct, unwilling to let emotion override practicality. "It's a long story," he said. "I have time," Caroline replied. "For once, we have nothing but time." 3 months later, Buck stood in Theodore Marsh's barn, now fully restored. The smoke damage had been cleaned, the scattered treasures reorganized, the missing pieces recovered from Cole's attempted theft. Catherine's portrait hung once again on the east wall, catching the morning light, just as Theodore had intended. But there were new additions now. Beside Catherine's portrait hung a photograph of Eleanor Bradford as a young woman, Theodore's daughter finally acknowledged. Below that, Buck had placed a brass plaque that told their story simply and honestly: Theodore Marsh and Catherine Aldridge, separated by violence and circumstance, united by enduring love. May their story remind us that it's never too late to speak the truths we've kept silent. Eleanor had cried when she saw it, touched the plaque with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she'd whispered. "Thank you for making sure they're not forgotten." The county had officially recognized the barn as a historical site, and Eleanor had agreed to help Buck turn it into a small museum, not for profit but for memory, so that Theodore and Catherine's love story, tragic but real, could teach others what Buck had learned, that fear and pride destroy more than any violence ever could. Caroline had stayed in Wyoming for 2 weeks after their first meeting. They'd spent hours together talking, learning each other. It hadn't all been easy. There were moments of anger, of tears, of painful silences. But they'd pushed through, committed to building something new from the ruins of what should have been. Before she left, Caroline had made Buck promise to visit Montana in March, when Margaret's baby was due. "You're going to be there when Theodore Harmon comes into the world," she told him firmly. No running, no excuses, Buck had promised. And he'd meant it. Now, standing in the barn on a cold February morning, Buck heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Sam, Eleanor, and someone unexpected, Sheriff Brennan. "Morning, Buck," Brennan said. "Got some news I thought you'd want to hear in person." They gathered around one of the restored tables, the same one Buck had, hidden behind during the standoff with Cole. Brennan pulled out a folder. "Cole's trial is over," the sheriff said. "Guilty on all counts: arson, attempted assault, conspiracy. And based on the evidence you and Eleanor found, we were able to reopen the investigation into Theodore Marsh's disappearance." Buck leaned forward. "And Marsh is dead, has been for 7 years. Cole's father and uncle confessed to everything once they realized the evidence was solid. Apparently, Theodore had contacted them in 2018, said he had proof of what their grandfathers did in 1890, was planning to go public. They lured him out to the old quarry, killed him, made it look like he'd wandered off and gotten lost. His remains were found last week." Eleanor made a small sound of grief, and Buck reached over to squeeze her hand. They'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still hurt. "There's more," Brennan continued. "Theodore left a will, dated a week before he disappeared. Everything, the mansion, the grounds, this barn, and all its contents, goes to any biological descendants. That means you, Eleanor. It's all yours." Eleanor stared at the sheriff, then at Buck. I can't." "You can," Buck said gently. "Theodore wanted you to have it, wanted his daughter to inherit his legacy, even if he never got to tell you himself." Eleanor wept quietly, and Buck put his arm around her shoulders. This elderly woman, discovering in her 70s that everything her father had built was meant for her all along. It was bittersweet, beautiful and painful in equal measure. After Brennan left, Eleanor turned to Buck. "I want you to stay," she said. "Be the caretaker here, help me run the museum. You understand Theodore's story better than anyone. You've earned the right to tell it, Buck looked around the barn, at the treasures carefully preserved, at Catherine's portrait gazing down with her sad, knowing eyes. He thought about Theodore Marsh, who'd never gotten to reclaim his love, about Catherine, who'd died with her truths unspoken, about himself, who'd nearly made the same mistakes. "I'd be honored," Buck said. "But I'll need time off in March, and visits to Montana regularly after that. I have grandchildren to meet, a great-grandson to welcome, a daughter to finally know." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "Of course. Family comes first. Theodore taught me that, even if he learned it too late." That afternoon, Buck rode Rufus back to Dusty Ridge for what he knew would be one of the last times. Sam met him on the porch, 2 cups of coffee already poured. "You're leaving," Sam said. "It wasn't a question. Taking the caretaker position at the barn," Buck confirmed. "Eleanor's offered me a cottage on the property. Figured it's time I had a real place to call home." Sam nodded slowly. "Good. You've been drifting long enough, Buck. Time you put down some roots." "Couldn't have done it without you," Buck said. "You gave me work when no one else would. Gave me a place to land when I had nowhere to go." "I won't forget that. Just be happy," Sam said simply. "That's all the thanks I need." Later that night, Buck packed his few belongings into a single trunk. The music box went on top, carefully wrapped. Beside it, he placed the photograph of Sarah and baby Caroline, and the new photograph Caroline had given him, his 3 grandchildren smiling at the camera at the bottom of the trunk. He placed Theodore's note, "The greatest tragedy isn't losing love. It's having the chance to reclaim it and choosing fear instead. Don't make my mistake." Buck had carried that note in his pocket for months now, read it so many times the paper was wearing thin. But he didn't need it anymore. The lesson was carved into his heart, woven into his bones. He'd made his choice. Not fear, but love. Not regret, but redemption. Not isolation, but connection. At 68 years old, Buck Harmon finally understood what Theodore Marsh had learned too late, that time is the only wealth we truly possess, and how we spend it determines everything. He had time left. Not as much as he would have liked, but enough. Enough to know his daughter, to meet his grandchildren, to be present for the life that remained. Enough to honor Theodore and Catherine's memory by living the truth they'd never gotten to claim. Enough to finally, after 40 years of running, come home. Outside, Rufus brayed impatiently, ready for whatever came next. Buck smiled, picked up his trunk, and walked out into the Montana dawn. The mountains stood eternal against the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle called. Buck Harmon was going home.